Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is Moed Katan. We are starting a new Masechet today. Today is our first lesson in this Masechet Moed Katan. So first of all, welcome everyone. First of all, those of you who are continuing in our learning, and those of you who are new, welcome everyone. I would also just like to mention that this shiur is dedicated by Elaine and Nisim Agassi for the Rifu'ah Shlema of Ophir Ben Etel Braina Eliana. So I should have a Rifu'ah Shlema, and may our learning help in Shemaim for a complete Rifu'ah Shlema. So what we are going to do, as I mentioned, this is our first lesson in Moed Katan. I would like to start off with an introduction to this Masechet. What does it mean, Moed Katan? The word means a small festival. And that really means that we are going to discuss the laws of Chol HaMOed. Chol HaMoed are, I think nowadays we call them the intermediate days or intermediary days of the festival. So if we're talking about Sukkot and Pesach, we generally have the first day or first 2 days if you live outside of Israel, which are like Shabbat in the sense that we do not work on those days. Then we have the days in the middle, Chol HaMoed, where it's not like Shabbat, but it's still a festival. And we're really going to discuss what does that mean, these intermediate days. Are they, right, on the one hand, they are part of, it's still Chag, it's still, let's say, Sukkot or Pesach. We still have many laws that apply. On the other hand, it's not like the first or the last day in the sense that many people definitely outside of Israel are going to work. How do we understand Chol HaMoed, right? Just the word. Chol means mundane, Moed means festival. So we have days that are kind of quasi-festival, and we're going to discuss in this Masechet what those days look like. So if you can see here in the picture, thank you to Web Yeshiva for making this slide, right? We have matzah for Pesach, and we have sukkah decorations, and we have the lulav and etrog, right? Because these days are the festivals, but there's something different about them. It's not like the first day, and it's not like the last day. So we're going to learn in this Masechet that we shouldn't actually be working on Chol HaMoed, but the sages allowed us to do some work if it is what's called a davar ha'aved. Davar ha'aved means something that if you don't do it, it will cause a loss. And therefore, right, think about in the days of agriculture, farmers, if they didn't work their land, that land would be either destroyed or definitely weaker. And therefore, the sages allowed us to do some sort of work in order to prevent loss. But the other side of that coin is we don't want you doing so much work that it's going to be excessive effort, right? And here in Hebrew, we say a tircha, right? Tircha means excessive effort. So we have to find a balance between not losing out, but not doing too much that it's a lot of effort. Other things that we're going to discuss, and I think things that we know, food preparation is allowed on the festival. Also, things for public use, which we're going to talk about today, are okay. 2 things we're going to learn about, 2 types of fields. The beginning of this Masechet is going to be very agricultural. We actually have some pictures that I'm going to share with you. Here, I'll even share it already now. I'll also open up my chat box if someone wants to ask a question while we're talking. First of all, thank you to the portal Daf Yomi, which is a Hebrew website that has a lot of tools for Daf Yomi, and they actually allowed they had a PDF of this entire book, which is in some Gemaras. It's called HaMaor HaMevu'ar, which is an illustration of many dapim that we're going to be discussing in this Masechet. So we're going to learn about two types of fields. One is called a Beit Hashlichin or Shlachin, and that is an irrigated field. You can see here it's a field where there's an irrigation ditch all around. It needs to be irrigated, as opposed to a Beit Haba'al, which means a field that does not need to be irrigated artificially, and we'll see why in a little bit. But it basically it relies completely on rainwater. We're going to talk about this in a minute. And the last note I just want to mention is, in general, when we learn a Gemara, on the page, on the inside of the inner margin, we generally have Rashi. In this Masechet, the Rashi is not Rashi, but it's actually Rabbeinu Gershom. So that's just important to understand that even though it looks like Rashi, it's not exactly Rashi. Okay, let's begin with our Masechet. As always, we start on Daf 2. Right, we start with Daf Bet, again to remind us that we are never beginning or ending our learning, but it's as if we've already begun. It's as if, we're just jumping right into it. We're already on page 2. So the Mishnah tells us on Daf Bet, on the second page, that you can water a Beit HaShlachim on Chol HaMOed and on Shemitah. Again, in the beginning of this Masechet, we're going to bring in a parallel between Chol HaMoed and Shemitah. There are going to be differences, but for right now, they're going to have similarities. So we see that you are allowed to water a field that relies solely on irrigation. Again, as we mentioned before, if you do not water it, it's going to die. We don't want the field to die, and therefore you are allowed to water it. You can water it from spring water, either from a new spring or an old spring. Either way, you are allowed to water it, but you're not allowed to water it from rainwater. The assumption is that, as you see here, if I have a spring near my field, all I need to do is open up this irrigation ditch and my field is easily watered. If I have to water my field either from rainwater, which happens to be sitting in a puddle kind of or pooled up next to my field, or we'll see in a minute or we can see right now you're not allowed to use a well to water your field. The idea here is, again, this is on Chol HaMoed. The idea here is it's going to take too much effort, right? If I need to take this water, the assumption is I'm going to have to use buckets. In order to bring water using buckets to all these fields, it's going to be a lot of effort, and we don't want you putting in that much effort on Chol HaMoed. Again, it's still supposed to be like a festival, and therefore we do not want you doing that much on the festival itself. The Gemara says you also can't make these ditches or these holes around the vineyard, around the grapevines. Again, this is considered excess effort. The idea is you should have done it before the festival. And then, again, this idea here is that it collects water. So you should have done it before, but you should not do it on Chol HaMoed itself. The Gemara talks about making these irrigation ditches. So the Gemara tells us that you can't make new irrigation ditches on Chol HaMoed or on Shemitah, but the sages say that you can do it on Shemitah and you can fix them as well. So again, here's a picture of these irrigation ditches. In Hebrew or in the Gemara, they're called an amma, amat hamayim. Amma, if you recall, is what we call a cubit, I think, right? This length from the tip of your fingers till your elbow, that's called an amma. It's actually a measurement. So an amat hamayim was an amma width, right? So that's this arrow over here. It's basically an irrigation ditch that is an amma wide and an amma deep, and that is how they used to irrigate their fields in those days. The Mishnah tells us that you can also fix public water cisterns and you can clean them out. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. And you're allowed to fix public roads. Again, what is happening during the festivals? We remember that we have what's called Aliyah LaRegel. The pilgrims are coming up to Jerusalem. We want to make sure that the roads are clear, that everybody can travel safely to Jerusalem and then back home. The Mishnah tells us on Daf 2 that you can also mark graves and you can check for kilayim. Kilayim being a mix of different species that you're not allowed to mix in a field, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Let's go to the Gemara now. The Gemara talks about, we talked about irrigating fields with springs. The Gemara asks, what's the issue with a new spring? Again, a spring, to remind us, is natural water that comes up from the ground. Why can you not use a new spring? I mean, you can, but what would you be concerned about? The Gemara tells us that we're nervous that maybe the walls will collapse and it'll cause you extra work. And the Gemara concludes we're not concerned about that. You could use new springs and and old springs as well. Again, we talked about different types of fields. So I mentioned a Beit HaShlachin was that field that needed external or artificial irrigation. A Beit HaBaal is this field here in picture number 6, which is a field that's in the valley, right? So just to remind us, right, if it rains and then it rains heavily, let's say, the rainwater will flow down the mountain and the valley will be filled with rainwater. This type of field does not need to be irrigated because it will be irrigated with rainwater. As I mentioned before, we said that you cannot do excessive work on Chol HaMoed. You can water trees, like individual trees, but not an entire field. Again, I want to limit the amount of work that we're doing on Chol HaMoed. The Gemara tells us that if a field is dried up, you can water it. So too, right, if one spring dries up and then you find another spring, so that is how the field became dry, and then you can, again, revive that field using the new spring. We talked about in the introduction this idea of not losing out, right? Davar ha'aved means we want to prevent a great loss. The other side of that coin is improving the field. So the Gemara tells us that in order to prevent loss, you can do work, but to improve the field, that's already not allowed, right? I don't want you to water just because you want to improve the field, but I can water the field in order to prevent the loss. The Gemara tells us, hold on, I'm going to get to some more pictures. We're going to talk about weeding, right? So this is a picture of weeding, right? Where you take out, right, grass that's growing or things that are growing that are foreign to the crop that you're trying to grow. So the Gemara asks that if you weed a field and you water it on Shabbat, is it considered plowing or is it considered sowing, right? Sowing as in SOW, right? Is it considered planting, right? Again, those of you who learned Masechet Shabbat with me, we learned the idea that every action, every milacha has a purpose, right? Or is forbidden because it creates a certain reality, right? So what does that mean? Let's look at each thing. Plowing, what does it mean to plow? You're promoting growth. But planting also promotes growth, right? You're planting a seed that promotes growth. So when I weed something, on one hand, I'm clearing the area. So I understand that maybe that's considered plowing, but maybe it falls under promoting growth, as in planting, because I am clearing the way for my, looks like in this picture, it's carrots, right? For my carrots to grow. So it's interesting to think about which milacha, which action is the issue that we're talking about here. And that is going to become very important when we deal with the laws of Shemitah. Again, to remind us, this year is actually Shemitah in Israel, and therefore certain activities are prohibited this year, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. The Gemara also tells us at the bottom of Daf 2 that if you prune and then you need the wood, right, that's here, right, if you prune the grapevines and then you need the wood, so again, you're liable for two things. One is you're planting in the sense that you're promoting the growth of your grapes, but you're also reaping, you're harvesting the wood so that you can use it. Again, so one action is actually seen as two different activities or two different milachot in terms of the laws of Shabbat. What if you weed and then cover up the dirt on kilayim? Again, kilayim means two different species that you're not allowed to plant together. So what about this? Here it says you're liable for weeding because, again, you're promoting growth. It also seems to be promoting the kilayim, and that would be problematic. How about on Shemitah? Are you allowed to water your field? And the Gemara says yes. One is that maybe because nowadays Shemitah is only rabbinic in origin and not biblical, and therefore maybe less strict. Or even when it's biblical in origin, it's only, again, as we said, the only things that you're not allowed to do are specific activities or actions, and not subcategories, right? In here we call them avot and toldot, right? Avot means general categories, as in av, father, but here it means general categories. A tolada or toldot are the subcategories. So the Gemara tells us at the top of Daf 3 that watering is okay if your field needs it, again, on Shemitah. Or maybe no, right? Again, all activities in the field are going to be prohibited, and you can't do any work in the field or in the vineyard. So there's a machloket, there's a difference of opinion when we get to Shemitah, what activities are permitted or prohibited. So the Gemara teaches us that only things that are done in both a field, meaning a field of grain or other produce, as opposed to a vineyard, and right, so any action that's done in both a field and in a vineyard are the actions that are prohibited on Shemitah. Or no, really, there's a difference if it's rabbinic in origin or biblical. So here the Gemara tells us that there are actually two types of hoeing, since we were talking about plowing. So the Gemara says one actually makes the trees stronger, right? So if you plow the area around, you're going to make the trees stronger. That would be problematic. The other is to close up cracks in the earth, Let me see if I have a picture of that. I don't think so. But that would be okay, right? Again, to prevent damage is okay, but to promote growth is not okay. And that is going to be actually the rule when we're talking about the laws of Shemitah. Those two issues are very important. Um, the next idea in the Gemara gets a little technical, so I'm just going to review the concept. We're going to learn a Talmudic concept of how to extrapolate ideas from verses in the Torah, in the Bible. There is a rule that if we have a general statement followed by a specific statement, this is called a klal and a prat. When we have those two things, one right after the other, then we say that the Torah was trying to limit that very general statement by limiting it only to that specific example. However, if we have a different structure, which is in Hebrew it's called klal, prat, and klal, that means a general statement followed by a specific statement, meaning specific examples, followed by another general statement. That specific pattern is going to teach us that it's not only those, let's say, 3, 4 examples or 2 examples that were given in the Torah. It's not only those two. Rather, the Torah was trying to teach us that there's a category of things that is broader than only the specific things that were mentioned. I'm sorry if that was a little confusing, but now we're going to get into the details here. So the Gemara says that let's discuss plowing during Shemitah. Again, it seems that, or it is, prohibited to plow during Shemitah, either because of a positive commandment or because of a negative commandment. And here, the Gemara tells us that with plowing, if we look at the verses, originally it was a general statement, which was actually phrased in a positive way. Then the specific statement was stated in a negative way, right? Don't do this. And here the question is this a regular klal prat or klal prat klal? The difference is that in general, they have to be said in the same way, meaning either all positive or in the negative. Here, when we talk about Shemitah, we have a mixing of positive and negative, and therefore there's a disagreement how we understand the verses. Either we say that it's not the regular framework, and therefore only the two things mentioned are the things that you're liable for. Again, what does it say? You need to let the land rest. That's positive. Then it says, don't plant or harvest. And then it says, the land needs to rest, right? So we see, again, general, specific, general, but we also see positive, negative, positive, and that is problematic. So the question is it only those two things, meaning planting and harvesting, or is it more of a broader understanding and anything done in the field would be problematic? So that is what our Gemara is grappling with. The Gemara continues and tells us that there maybe the discussion really is not during Shemitah itself, but the additional time that was added before the beginning of the year, right? Again, we know that the beginning of the year is Rosh Hashanah, but the Gemara tells us that they actually added a month before that you're not allowed to plow your fields, either your orchard or your field, for a certain amount of time before Shemitah happens in preparation for Shemitah. And therefore, the Gemara tells us that no, really, right? Maybe there's that added time. The Gemara says no, you really can plow all the way till Rosh Hashanah. But again, the sages kind of added 30 days before that you can't plow the orchard of old trees. Again, if it's new trees, then you can in order to make sure that they take root, but not for old trees. And that is the discussion at the bottom of Daf 3. Okay, Daf 4 discusses the verses about, again, not plowing in Elul, right, in this added time. And then we say, no, this is actually speaking about obligatory versus optional types of harvesting. What does that mean? In general, when I have my own field, I can decide if I want to harvest them or not. What is an obligatory harvest? The Gemara explains the Omer. If you remember Masechet Psachim, we learned about the sacrifice of the barley. That's called the Omer sacrifice. And that is an obligatory harvest. You must harvest that, and that can be done. Okay. The Gemara continues talking about so 1 second, we're going to get to the end. Make sure we have pictures. Okay, we are going to get here in a second. Okay, the Gemara talks about, remember, as I mentioned in the beginning, that you are not allowed to use a well or rainwater because we are afraid you're going to have to go back and forth with buckets, and therefore that would be problematic. It's a lot of effort. Daf 4 talks about this effort. Why can't we use rainwater? The Gemara says that it's a gzeira, it's a decree, so that you don't use buckets in a well. Again, if I allow you to use buckets in a nearby, let's say, puddle or area that collected rainwater, you might then say, oh, if I can do that, so then maybe I can use my buckets in the well. Or maybe we are concerned that the rainwater is going to dry up, and then you're going to have to, again, use much more effort in order to get the water to your property. What about streams that get their water from ponds? I think maybe that's this top picture. You can see here there's like a larger body of water at the top right, and then it seems to kind of flow into something again at the top. So here you can use this water to water your field on Chol HaMOed. Maybe the water will run out. We say no, the water's not going to run out because again it's flowing. What about if there is a water canal between fields, right? You can see here again in this picture, there seems to be this connection between, I think this is like an upper field and a lower field where the water is running down. So that seems to be okay, right? Meaning if the pool has water dripping into it from an upper field, then you can use that water to irrigate your lower field. We're not concerned that maybe it'll dry up. Or maybe as long as it's still dripping, you can use it, right? You can't draw water from the lower field to water the upper field. Again, that makes sense because, again, it's a lot of effort. It's a tircha. It's going to be too much effort in order to water that field. What about the Gemara tells us that you can water your vegetables on Chol HaMoed in order to eat them on that festival, but you cannot water the field, that vegetable patch, if it's to make them grow stronger, right? Again, to improve is problematic, and the Gemara actually tells a story that this actually happens, and then again, if it's to If it's to make the fruit, the vegetables stay fresh to eat them, that would be okay. And if it's not, then you cannot do it. What about digging around a grapevine and then to fill that in with water? So you cannot do that on Chol HaMoed. Again, it's seen as too much effort. And let me see. Okay, we don't have a picture of that yet. But you can't make new, like those ditches around the grapes. You can't make new ones, but you can clear the old ones out. That would be okay. What about making a canal? Here, there's a great picture of a man digging a canal. I don't think it was meant to be that deep, but the Gemara says you cannot dig this canal on Chol HaMoed, again, because it's a lot of effort. That looks like a lot of effort over there. On Shemitah, it's problematic because the Gemara tells us that it looks like you're hoeing. It looks like you're plowing the earth, and that is problematic. Or maybe it's because it looks like you're preparing the ground around, right? This picture shows it very nicely. If you take all the dirt from inside the canal and you put it all around, that looks like perfect soil to plant new seeds. That is problematic on Shemitah. However, the Gemara says that if you're digging the ditch and as you're digging it, it's filling with water, that would be okay because it's very clear what you're doing. Right here, it's very clear that you're digging an irrigation ditch, and therefore that would be okay. Right? Or another option is if you dig the ditch and you throw, this is a great picture, right? You throw the dirt far away from the ditch, and therefore it doesn't pile up like we saw before. It just becomes kind of even with the field, and then that would be okay. The Gemara talks about what about piling fertilizer in your field, right? Fertilizing your field is problematic on Shemitah, during Shemitah. But what if I want to store my fertilizer in my field? So the Gemara says it's no problem as long as you do it this way. Again, these pictures I think are great. Right? Either you dig a hole that's 3 tfachim down, 3 hand breadths down, or you make an elevation of 3 hand breadths up. Right? Either way, it shows I'm not fertilizing my field. I'm just piling my fertilizer there, right? Or I'm storing it there. Can you read? The Gemara tells us at the bottom of 4 that you can re-dig a canal that got filled up with dirt, right? So basically, to clear it out, you're allowed to do that. Different sages allowed people to clear away different rivers. Again, here we're going to discuss public needs, and it's important to understand that you can fix things that the public needs. So we talked about clearing out the debris from a cistern. This is a picture of a cistern. A cistern is as opposed to a well, a cistern is what we would call a reservoir, right? Something that collects rainwater. As opposed to a well that is, right, you dig down to groundwater, right? So that's just in terms of a difference between what we would call bore in Hebrew. Bore is a cistern, as opposed to be'er, which is a well. So the Gemara talks about clearing out debris from a cistern at the top of Daf 5, but you can't dig a new cistern. That is not okay. However, the Gemara says that if the public does need a new cistern, then you can dig a new one on Chol HaMoed. And here, really, the Gemara expresses this idea or this fundamental concept of making sure public needs are met. This, again, as I mentioned before, during the festival, we understand that people are on the roads. We want to make sure that they have water to drink. Again, this is what we would call the gas station on the side of the road, right? We want to make sure that there is a cistern on the road. Again, you're generally traveling with donkeys, cattle, goats, and sheep. They need to be watered, right? We need to gas up the car. We need to water them. That's what these cisterns are. We need to make sure that the people have water. So the public need is very important. And the Gemara basically tells us that whatever the public needs, you must do, even if it takes a lot of effort. One of those things is clearing the road, right? So again, the roads were not paved necessarily. Some were, but many weren't. So let's say if thorns grew on the road, you need to make sure that those thorns are cleared out, right? Here's a very graphic picture of a person walking in the thorns. If you do not clear them, blood will be shed, right? And the Gemara tells us that that blood is on your hands, literally, right? If you do not take care of public walkways, public areas. And I think it's really just so beautiful to understand this responsibility for the community. So those of you who were with me last week, I spoke about when we finished Masechet Megillah, this idea of communal responsibility, the idea that we're all part of a larger community and nation. This Gemara is really beginning with that idea that we're going to let you do even excessive work in order to prevent people getting hurt on the road. Let's talk about marking graves. That's the next topic. We are allowed to mark graves, says the Gemara, on Chol HaMOed. What's this idea of marking graves? It's important to understand that when we are we're not talking about, when we talk about marking graves, I think for many of us, we think about putting up a tombstone, which is very important, but that's actually not what we're talking about on Daf 5. Daf 5 is actually discussing if you are burying a person, you want to make sure that we mark that grave because, first of all, it's important to know where a person is buried, but also because of purity. If you remember, in the time of the temple, people are very careful about becoming or staying pure as opposed to becoming impure, right? Tameh as opposed to tahor. And if there is a grave on the road, or in a field, if you walk over that grave, you are now creating a what's called an ohel, right? A tent over the grave, and that will make you tameh, right? That will make you impure, right? Again, just to remind us that if this concept of tumat ohel, what does that mean? If a dead body is under one roof with numerous other things, everything under that roof becomes tameh. That's one idea. The other idea, as I just mentioned, is this idea that if you stand over a grave, you are the ohel, you are that enclosure, and then you and everything that you're carrying becomes tameh. Why is this important? Again, as I mentioned, let's say you are a priest, a kohen, who eats truma. Truma is sanctified and must be eaten when you are tahor, when you are pure. And not only that, but if you are impure and you touch the truma, you actually make it impure and it now needs to be burnt. We want to prevent that damage. And therefore, the Gemara is going to go out of its way to talk about marking graves and marking where there is something that's buried that will create impurity, and we have to be very careful. So the Gemara tells us on Daf 5 that you don't have to mark a grave if there's something there that will not create impurity. What is that? If you have exactly an olive size of flesh, we'll discuss that in 1 minute, or a bone the size of a barley. Here, I don't know if you can tell that that's a barley seed, but it's a very small bone. That is not going to make you impure, and therefore you do not have to mark it, but you do have to mark if there is a spinal column buried there or a skull, right? These are seen as very important and do give impurity, or if the majority of bones are there, you also need to mark that area. You do not have to mark an obvious grave, meaning, again, if it's in a cemetery, it is obvious that there are graves in a cemetery. You do not need, again, I'm not talking about headstones. There is also an importance to that, but here I'm talking about actually outlining an area. I know that there are graves in a graveyard. You should not be walking in a graveyard if you cannot become impure. But you do need to mark if we're not sure where something is buried, right? For example, if you have a tree and you know that there's a body buried under one of the branches, you're just not sure where, you need to mark that whole area. So too with protrusions of stone, right? If this stone protrudes, let's say it's one big stone, if on the other side of this wall is a grave, and the same stone kind of covers the grave and covers the street, that is problematic. I remember growing up in Queens, there was a cemetery, and there are, right, in general, you should not plant trees near cemeteries, because what's the issue? If you have a tree that overhangs one side over a grave and the other side over the street, the person walking on the street can become impure. That would be problematic. So therefore, that does need to be marked. The Gemara tells us that you do not put the marker directly on top of the grave. Rather, you move it over a little bit so that I shouldn't walk in only when I get on top of it do I realize that it's there. On the other hand, you don't move it too far away. And this is a beautiful line. The Gemara says, why? Because I don't want to lose any land of Israel, right? I don't want to lose 1 inch of the land. What does that mean? I don't want to prevent people from walking on the land of Israel, and therefore I'm going to limit what I mark off when I'm marking this grave. And I thought it was just a beautiful idea about the importance of, right, walking in Eretz Yisrael, right? They say every step you take in Israel is a mitzvah, that you're walking on the land. So we see that reflected here in on Daf 5 as well. Okay, the Gemara tells us that when I talked about a flesh that is a piece of flesh that's exactly an olive size, that does cause impurity. But the idea here is that since when you bury it, it's going to shrink rather quickly, we do not say that it's important to mark it, because later on it will not cause impurity. The Gemara continues and talks about a concept or a field that's called a Beit HaPras. Beit HaPras means that it's a plowed field, but there's a grave somewhere in the field. And now, right, there was a grave, then you plowed it, and I guess it wasn't marked or you didn't realize, and now, unfortunately, there are now bones all over, or bone fragments all over this field. So the Gemara tells us, we actually learned it in Masechet Psachim, which is why in the picture he's actually leading an animal literally to the slaughter. This is probably his Korban Pesach. But what's happening? That if you're on the way to Korban Pesach, on the way to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash, to sacrifice your animal, and you need to cross this field, a Beit HaPras, what do? You can actually blow. I like that it had a field. I always envisioned that like they bend down and blow, but that makes much more sense, right? You blow like the dirt in front of you to make sure there are no bones there, and then you can continue. It sounds a little labor intensive, but the Gemara says that is something that you can do, and you check that there are no bones, and then you can walk. Also, the Gemara tells us if many people walk through this field, then we can already assume that whatever fragments were there are lost or already like kind of buried deep inside, and maybe or they're gone already or broken up, and therefore it would not be tameh, impure. And the Gemara at the bottom of Daf 5 tells us that really there are three types of Beit HaPras, of this type of field. One is that there's a grave in this, there's a grave in this field, you're just not sure where it is. Number two is there was a grave in the field and now it was plowed over, and that is number two. And the third is something called a field of tears. And the Gemara describes that this is a field that's in between two cities. And basically, when they wanted to transport a body from one city to the next city, this would be the meeting point. And that field became known as a field of tears. The Gemara says that in all of these fields, you need to ask the elder of the town or the scholar of the town, and they will tell you exactly where these graves are. Again, here the Gemara tells us communal responsibility, right? The scholar, right, the rabbi of the community, the scholar of the community must know all of these I guess we would call them communal issues or religious issues. He needs to know where the graves are, where it's important to mark, and he will tell you what type of field it is. What happens if you get to a field? And again, I'm really so thankful for these illustrations. There's a marker at the beginning of the field. Where is the grave? What does this mean, right? How do I interpret it? The Gemara says that maybe we can assume, right, if it looks like this, maybe there's a grave in the middle and not on the edges. Again, wherever there are going to be trees, we assume it was plowed, and therefore this plowed area around, maybe that means that there's a body in the middle. The Gemara says, no, it must be that this is what the field looks like, right, where it's all plowed, there are trees all over, and basically then we really don't know where the grave is, and we assume it's somewhere in this entire field. From here, the Gemara talks about how do you mark the area. Again, this one seems to be a little ridiculous. I don't think it's such a large stone. I think it's a much smaller stone, but who knows? At least that's the way I pictured it, right? So basically what they would do is cover a stone in lime, right? That's how you knew that it was a marker. And then again, as we mentioned, we do assume that it's underneath that stone. I guess maybe that's why they made such a big one. Maybe it's saying underneath this stone is a body, so just be careful. What if I find this, right? What if I find two markers with a line connecting them? So if there's a line of lime, again, connecting the two stones, we can assume that there's a dead body from here to here, right? This is a marker. We assume that this whole area, again, between the two stones is tameh, is impure. If, however, we get to this scenario, we can assume that there's a body under this stone and a body under the other stone, right? Meaning that this happens to be a plowed field in between, but because there's no marker in between, we do not have to be concerned for the land in between. This one is a little bit more problematic, right? Because it seems to be that there was a marker and it was plowed over. So that seems to imply that the area in between the stones do imply that the whole area in between the two are impure. From here, the Gemara starts to talk about kilayim. As I mentioned before, kilayim, I don't know how to say that. I don't know if there's a word for it in English. But kilayim means planting two species together. That is prohibited. And the Gemara tells us that they would actually send out people around Purim time to make sure that nobody, again, that's the time people are planting and therefore make sure that people are keeping to the laws and not planting two types of species. And basically, right there, it was usually grain and grapes together. And the Gemara says that, wait a minute, so why are we talking about on, yes, kilayim? I was just wondering if there was an English word for it. Hybridization, interesting. I don't think so, only because that seems to imply that it's the same plant, right? Like grafting and things like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually, though that is part actually of kilayim, you are correct. But here we're actually talking about like basically doing one row wheat, one row grapes, one row wheat, right? That would be, but maybe if that's called hybridization. So excellent. Thank you. Okay. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If I already sent out people in Adar around Purim, why am I talking about this on Chol HaMOed, which is Pesach, right? A whole month later. Interestingly, we see that times don't change too much. The Gemara says, on Chol HaMOed, again, people aren't working, so you can get much cheaper labor. And therefore, people would maybe wait till Chol HaMOed to hire the cheaper labor and send them out only on Chol HaMOed. And therefore, if that was the case, they could go out. Again, interestingly, it's not because they're being cheap, but the Gemara says that sometimes they were using communal funds. And again, if we're using communal funds, we want to reduce the amount that we are spending. Excellent. Lizette is answering this idea of you're right that when we plant things together, even if we're not grafting them, they are still mixing. So thank you very much. I think she has a lot of experience in planting and agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you for your knowledge. The Gemara talks about, again, these fields and what you need to uproot. Apparently, originally, the Gemara tells us they used to uproot. We are now on Daf 6. The Gemara says that they used to uproot these kilayim, the crops, if they were mixed, and then kind of throw it to the animals to eat. And then the farmers would be like, oh, this is great. You're weeding my crops and you're feeding my animals. This is awesome. So then they said, you know what, forget it. We're going to pull it out and we're going to throw it in the street. And they're like, oh, this is still great. You're weeding my field. And therefore, what would they do? Instead of pulling out the crops, the people who are going around would actually say, this entire field is ownerless, and whoever wants to come can come and take the produce. That obviously is not something that the farmers wanted, and then they were much more careful about their what they were planting. The next Mishnah tells us that you can draw water from one tree to another, but you can't water, again, as we mentioned, an entire field. You can't water plants on Chol HaMoed that you didn't water beforehand, right? If you didn't water them before Pesach, it wasn't so important for you to water them before, so therefore you're not allowed to, again, go out of your way to water them now. The sages say, actually, for both of these things, it is okay, and you can water them as well. Again, as we mentioned, the Gemara says that a naturally watered field that did get dry or dried out, you can water it on Chol HaMoed. And here the Gemara talks about, I guess, what we would call lightly watering or sprinkling water as opposed to actually irrigating a field. So the Gemara talks about this like sprinkling of water is definitely better if it's going to, again, prevent any loss for your fields. The next Mishnah, again, we're trying to prevent damage to our fields. So the Gemara tells us that you can trap moles and mice from orchards and grain fields in the usual manner. You don't have to do it with a shinui. Again, these animals apparently, maybe Lizette can tell us, but apparently they really ruin the field. I think next week we'll discuss it more, but there's actually a picture of this, which seems to be, I guess this is a trap, but I guess these moles go, bury underground and really ruin the fields. So the Gemara says that you can trap them on Chol HaMoed and on Shemitah in the regular way, because again, we want to make sure that we're preventing damage. You can also fix a breach in a fence on Chol HaMoed, and you can build new walls on a Shemitah year. We're going to talk more about that next week. But interestingly, the Gemara calls these moles, right? I guess here's the picture of them. The Gemara calls these moles, they're called ishut, and here the idea is that it means that they don't have eyes. And interestingly, I don't think it means they don't literally have eyes, but because they live underground, they're seen as animals that don't have eyes, and therefore you're allowed to trap them. The Gemara also talks about destroying anthills. There was an interesting discussion about the distance between the anthills and if there's water in between them or a bridge in between them. But it was a very interesting discussion, but you are allowed to destroy these anthills if they're going to destroy your fields. So with that, we concluded our first week of Masechet Moed Katan. I really thank everyone for joining us this week, and may we continue in our learning. Also, happy Tu B'Shvat for all of you who celebrated Tu B'Shvat this week. Again, we're talking about fields and produce and trees, so it's really a beautiful way to start Moed Katan. So really wishing everyone a wonderful week, and see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.